Welcome to Workbook Lesson 3 for Bright Old Testament 502-504, Hebrew 1 and 2 online edition. Today we're going to be working through Van Pelt Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. However, Chapter 5 exercises go primarily from English to Hebrew, whereas I prefer to emphasize going from Hebrew to English, since that's what we do when we translate the Old Testament. So instead of using the workbook exercises for Chapter 5, there is a handout for Chapter 5 on Canvas. You may be able to use the exercise answer key and your workbook in order to answer the questions from Chapter 5 and to double check your work, because I've simply reverse engineered those exercises to go from the Hebrew to the English rather than vice versa. In other words, I've given you the answers and you're now giving me the question, almost like Jeopardy! Chapter 6 is pretty straightforward. It's the same as is in your workbook, and we'll be working through that together. So let's go ahead and jump into exercise part 5 and part 6. In part 5 exercises, section 1, you are asked to explain why the vowel underneath the hey of the definite article is what it is in the given example. For instance, in number 1, we know that the definite article standard form is hey plus a patak plus a dagesh in the next letter. So why do we not have a patak here, and why is there no dagesh in the aleph? Basically, you are explaining to me why we see what we see, not only in this example, but in all the following examples. I'll give you just a moment to consider, why do we have a kametz under the hey and no dagesh in the aleph, when that is what we would expect in the standard form? Think about it for a moment and then write down your answer. The answer has to do with aleph, one of those pesky gutturals, remembering that gutturals do not take a dagesh. In other words, they don't double. So in this particular instance, because we cannot put a dagesh in the aleph, we would be left with a patak underneath the hey, which would be an open syllable. There would be no consonant to close the syllable, which is what typically the doubled letter would do, the first letter of the doubling closing that syllable of the hey plus the patak. But since we can't double the aleph here in order to close the syllable, and since we can't have a patak in an open syllable, we have to lengthen the vowel. Thus, we have kametz, which is a long A. Now look at the second example, hamelech. What exactly is going on here? I'll give you a few seconds to consider. What we have going on here is actually pretty boring, because it is just the standard form. Hey plus a patak plus a dagesh forte in the next letter, in this case, mem. One of the mems of the doubled mem closes that syllable, hey patak mem, and then the other mem starts the next syllable, mem plus the segol. You'll notice that this is called a segolet, not only because of the fact that we have segols, which is the most common form, but because we have two short vowels, and yet the accent is on the first syllable of the noun. So this is not melech, this is melech. And if you remember your rules, when we accent an open syllable, we're allowed to have a short vowel. Now let's go to the next one, ha'isha. Why do we have a kametz underneath the hey? I'll give you a few seconds. We have the hey plus the kametz for the same reason that we did in number 1. We have an aleph, which resists the dagesh, so the patak has to lengthen to a kametz, so that we avoid having the short A in an open syllable. How about the next one, hasefer? This one, you'll notice, actually has a long vowel underneath the samek, which really doesn't affect the definite article at all, but it does show that even though we have a segolet here, where we would typically have two short vowels, occasionally we have a long vowel underneath the first consonant, even though it is accented. This is allowed, perhaps not preferred, but it is allowed, and usually has to do with particular types of nouns. Again, as odd as that sere underneath the samek may appear, instead of sefer, we actually have standard form here. Patak plus a dagesh forte in the samek, closing off the syllable of the hey plus the patak. What about the next one, haderek? Again, noticing that we've switched back to a short vowel under the dalet, which is what we typically expect in segolets. Why do we have hey plus patak plus dagesh in the dalet? Hopefully you didn't overthink this. This is simply the form of the definite article. Hey plus patak plus dagesh in the next letter. What about the final one here? We have hey plus a patak, which we would expect in standard form, but there is no dagesh in the chet. So where is the dagesh? And why do we not have a kametz under the hey? Once again, the issue is a guttural. Chet does not take a dagesh and therefore does not double, but it does not lengthen the previous vowel. We call this implicit doubling. It's as though there's a dagesh in the chet, but it's not written. So it's as though that prior syllable is closed, even though we would technically say that the prior syllable is open, because there is no actual chet closing the syllable. It's just as though there was. This has to do with the development of hey and chet historically versus the development of aleph and ayin. Aleph, ayin, resh will resist the dagesh and cause the previous vowel to lengthen. Chet and hey, for whatever reason, often will not. So implicitly doubled, as though it were, but it's not. All right, let's move on to our next exercises. In this section of exercise, you are doing the same thing that you did in the previous set of exercises, only instead of explaining what the vowel is underneath the hey, we're explaining what the vowel is underneath the vav. We would expect the vav to have a shva, which is what we see in the first two examples here, vashofet and vahashofet. Actually, the second example also has the definite article, which is the hey plus the patak plus the dagesh in the shin. We have a vav with the shva, which is what we would expect. But what about the third example? Instead of vabarit, we have varit. Why is there an here? I'll give you a few seconds to consider. We have a shurik as our conjunctive or disjunctive, and or but, affixed to barit, and changed to a shurik because it is a bump letter. Remember, bump stands for bait, mem, or pay, and since barit starts with a bait, we change the vav plus the shva to a shurik. So we have here preceding a bump letter. Occasionally you'll see shurik before really short words as well. We just don't have a fancy acronym to remind us of that. Instead, we only use bump. Bait, mem, pay are preceded by a shurik. What about the next example? The adom. Why do we have a segol underneath the vav instead of a shva? The answer indirectly has to do with the fact that we have an aleph here. Directly, it has to do with the vowel, or the hatef vowel, the half vowel, as it were, underneath the aleph. Remember that gutturals, like aleph, do not take a simple shva, which is what we would expect in this sort of situation. Instead, they take a compound shva, or a hatef vowel, a vowel combined with a shva, in this case, segol shva, or hatef segol. Because of this, the rule of shva states that if you have two simple shvas, the first shva simply becomes a hirik. If you have a compound shva, however, the previous shva will take whatever vowel is combined with the shva in the compound shva. And since we have segol shva here, or hatef segol, we have segol underneath the vav. This may seem really confusing, but basically whatever vowel comes with the shva is the vowel that shows up before the shva. So we get the adom, the ve instead of v. No shva, but a segol. What about the next one? Why do we have shurik before ven? This is because we have a bait starting our word ben, or in this case, vein, here in our example of a conjunctive or disjunctive and or but, the vav plus the shva, being affixed to a word that starts with a bump letter, which is what bait is. So it becomes shurik. What about the next example? Why do we have vav plus a shva? This answer should be really easy, because we always have vav plus a shva, unless of course we don't, but this is the standard form. this is what we expect most often. Vav plus a shva. Of course, in the next example, we don't have vav plus a shva, we have vav plus a patak. So what's going on here? Well, once again, we have a hatef vowel, in this case hatef patak or patak shva, a compound shva underneath the chet because chet is a guttural. And since our rule of shva says that when we have a simple shva preceding a compound shva, the simple shva simply takes the vowel of the compound shva. The vowel of the compound shva is patak, so the vowel underneath the vav is patak. What about the next one? Velohim. This is a really tricky one. Why do we have vav plus a sere? As I said, this one is very tricksy and requires you to know your vocabulary. The word is Elohim, with the aleph combined with a hatef segol, or a compound shva. Our rule of shva says that when we affix a letter that has a simple shva in front of a letter with a compound shva, the simple shva becomes the same as the vowel of the compound shva, like in the previous example, vahamor, where the vav took the patak. Here we would expect the vav to take the segol. However, this is followed by aleph, and aleph has a tendency to quiesce. We call this quiescent aleph, which is simply a fancy word that means it's quiet. It no longer takes any vowel. And since the aleph doesn't take any vowel, it's as though it's not there. Instead, it's simply assisting or helping out with that previous vowel, keeping that vowel from reducing, so that we wouldn't get velohim with a shva underneath the vav, but instead we have a long vowel that has lengthened from the segol to a sere when the aleph quiesced. So here we have what should have been a hatef vowel, but with the quiescent aleph becomes not a segol, but a sere. Again, very tricksy. Don't feel too bad if you didn't get that one. All right, let's move on to our next set of exercises. In this section of exercises, you're simply translating. So, translate. What is number 1? I'll give you a few seconds to consider. Well, if you used your lexicon, or if you've already memorized some vocabulary, that you know this is the fire and the cloud, probably taken from Exodus. We have the word aish, we have the word anan, and we have added 2 definite articles onto the front. The hey plus the comments is because we can't put a dagesh in the aleph, so we have a lengthening of the patak under the hey. We also have a vav plus a shva, which is and, because there's nothing particularly interesting about the hey that follows. But the hey has a segol instead of the expected patak plus a dagesh in the ayin, because of the fact that ayin doesn't take a dagesh. So we would expect a long A underneath the hey. However, if you remember your exercises and the explanation that was given in the video, when we have a comments plus a comments, typically we will have a segol instead of a comments. So in this case, the compensatory lengthening of not taking the dagesh in the ayin would have made it a comments, but since we have a comments as the vowel under the ayin, instead it becomes a segol. But this is still ha'esh v'ha'anan, the fire and the cloud. Actually, in this particular example, you could take all of the vowels, all of the markings, the nikud, you could take all of those out, and you would still know that this is ha'esh v'ha'anan because of the fact that you have the word esh and the word anan, plus the definite article in front of each, and a conjunctive in front of v'ha'anan. So, the fire and the cloud. I'll now go on to number 5 and let you figure out number 2 and number 3 because of the fact that they're fairly simple. So I'll drop down to number 5 and we'll take a look at that one. So what do we have going on in number 5? We have comments as under the hays, which may take us by surprise, but how would we translate this phrase? I'll give you a few seconds. What we have is simply the man and the woman. The Hays both take the Comets because they can't put a dagesh in the Alephs, so we have lengthening to a Comets. Ha-ish, v'ha-isha. We have just a standard form of the conjunction here, vav plus a shva. I do want to quickly point out that we have a dagesh in the shin. This is not a yod from the previous word. Although ish and isha sound very similar, they are not actually from the same root. The dagesh that is in the shin is actually from a nun. Normally we get anash and enosh, those two words for man and woman, and you actually see in the plural, because the plural of ish is anoshim. Thus we have the dagesh in the shin representing the nun, but since ish comes from a different word, we don't have a nun or a dagesh here. And for whatever reason, there is no plural of ish as ishim. Instead, we use a completely different word for the word man and men, ish and anoshim, which again have nothing to do with each other. But this is why we have a hirik yod in ish, and we have a dagesh in isha. They sound similar, but they're actually from different roots. That part really isn't all that relevant to this particular lesson. That part's just for free. What you need to know is that the Hays plus the Comets is because the dagesh cannot go into the Aleph in ish and isha. Okay, let's back up one and look at number 4. How would we translate number 4? This one is a little bit of a trick question. It's very simple. Av means father. Vein comes from ben, means son. And so we have father and son. The shurik in front of the veit having to do with the fact that veit is a bump letter. Beit, mem, or pei. You'll notice, though, there is no definite article. So it's a father and a son. Okay, let's move on to our last set of exercises from part 6. Here, once again, in exercise 1 in part 6, you're simply translating. Translate these words. I'll give you just a second to answer number 3 and number 4, and you can do the rest by yourself. The answers for number 3 and number 4 in exercise 1 of part 6 are in a land and in the land. The difference between a and the being the presence of the definite article, which is discovered by looking at the vowel underneath the beit preposition. Beit plus a shva is the typical form of the preposition in. Here, in number 3, we do have beit plus a shva. So this is in a land, ba eretz. In number 4, though, we have beit plus a comets underneath the beit. The comets is because of the presence of the definite article. Typically, this would have been he plus a patak plus a dagesh in the aleph. However, as we've seen already, aleph does not take a dagesh, so the vowel underneath the he lengthens to a comets. When beit is added to the front of the word, the he disappears. He, as you will notice many times throughout these next 2 classes, is a chicken letter. He will run away any opportunity that it gets. When it runs away, it leaves behind its vowel, which takes the place of the shva under the beit. Thus we get beit plus a comets in the land, the comets being the vowel indicating that this is the definite article. Let's move on now to exercise number 2. How do we translate number 1, batok hanahar? The answer is in the midst of the river. The river, ha-nahar, is the he plus the patak plus the dagesh in the nun, the expected form. Batok is simply the preposition in the midst of. You'll notice, though, that it's in the midst of, not in a midst of. We'll explain why in a later lesson, but basically if you have a preposition that's followed by the word it's modifying with a definite article, it also will have the definite article. So this is not a midst, this is the midst, in the midst of the river. What about number 2? Try number 2. Number 2 is simply until the day. We have ad, until, and hayom, the, hey plus a patak plus the dagesh in the yod, and then the word yom, day, until the day. Okay, here's the third example, and then we will let you do the rest of the exercises on your own and check your own work. But how do we translate number 3? Well, number 3 is very much like number 1, and that is that we have batok, in the midst of, and then ha'ir, ear being the word city, and the hey plus the kametz being the definite article. We would have expected hey plus a patak plus a dagesh in the ayin, but ayin again is a guttural, which resists the dagesh, causing the vowel underneath the hey to lengthen to a kametz. And again, since we have a definite, the city, it makes sense to translate this as in the midst of the city. Well, that's the end of our example exercises. Finish the rest of your exercises from Part 5 and Part 6 on your own. Take a picture after you've corrected it, and then send it to me.